Well, I will certainly not be the first person to ever say this. In fact, first explicit enunciation of what I'm about to say I heard of is at least 500 or 600 years old, and my guess is that it's been known since at least antiquity. And that is the idea that ideology is really the most important and the necessary condition for a state. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other important conditions and other uh, variables that can help and or contribute to the existence of a state, but the one that must be present is ideological support. Without this, the only other way to retain taxational taxable powers over a populace is through brute force, and this is extremely risky, extremely expensive, very counterproductive, and very likely impossible in the long run. I guess you could make an argument of, uh, well, it depends on the population. So if we had 90% of the people aggressing against 10% of the people, to, I guess in that situation you don't need ideological support, but then you do need ideological support within the 90%. So for a minority to rule at all, they have to have ideological support of some kind or another. And I think it's pretty clear that whatever you or I might think, that the state clearly does think this, because the state expends an enormous amount of resources towards that end. And it depends on which state and how they do it. In Saudi Arabia, basically all the clerics are on the payroll of the government, or the most of them, all the major ones anyway. The Saudi royal family a long time ago just decided that's the best way to go. That's how they do it. In the United States, it's mostly through the schools and through the media, which is, although this is less true now than it has been in the past, essentially a corporatist entity that was granted uh, an oligopoly over broadcasting rights, and in return, they cannot be very critical of the government. And obviously, public schooling is, I mean, explicitly in some cases, very explicitly in some cases, designed to make people into obedient automatons of the state. There are other nefarious things that people wish public schooling to accomplish, to abolish religion, to abolish ethnic groups. A big push was to make immigrants become more like normal Americans. I'm speaking now in the specific case of America, but uh, the reason the government is so willing to expend so much money on it is because they get something from it, and what they get from it is obedience, or at least that's the idea. Uh, and we can go on and on. Even the most tyrannical regimes uh, have to couch what they do in terms that will cause people to acquiesce ideologically. So even the Nazis didn't come out and say, well, we just want to launch an aggressive war because I want Lebensraum. They said that they were being attacked and surrounded by the British. There's a number of instances where there were perhaps minor but still existent protest movements in the Third Reich. Uh, One that comes to mind is a number of there's two that come to mind. One was when a number of Jewish soldiers who were in the Wehrmacht were rounded up and sent to camps. Their wives showed up at the train station, and the Gestapo was very worried that if they just came and arrested all these women, that it would look really, really bad. And so rather than reveal their butchery, they decided to let the men go. Similarly, there was actually some kind of party, a Nazi party declaration that crucifixes and Catholic iconography should be purged from the military, and many, many, many people protested, and Hitler actually had the party official who had declared this, he didn't have him killed or anything, but he had him removed from his post. He said, obviously, you can retain your crucifixes and your Catholic iconography. And why would they do this if they were just the ruled by the sword alone and had nothing to consider other than their own malevolent interests? Because they have to consider the ideology of the people beneath them. Otherwise, they'll find themselves in a lot more trouble than they otherwise would be. And I think, broadly speaking, I think it's clear, even if we don't have a state, any person or entity that is granted the kind of ideological leeway that a state is, namely the double standard of the hypocrisy, where it's wrong for anyone else to do something but okay for a third party, then you're going to get abuses. So if I say, not to make this example too explicitly similar to the real world, let's say that perhaps my parents were leaders in a religious community, something that would probably be termed a cult. I'll just say a fairly insular community, perhaps of a couple thousand people, and I'm born to my parents, and people in that community, for all intents and purposes, believe that for some reason, I have some type of religious mandate above and beyond the rest of them. So I can marry whomever I like, I can repossess the property of whomever I like at whatever time, for whatever reason, and this is just by virtue of me being who I am. I don't have to be a state to basically ruin that society or to take advantage of it, and I'd be perfectly incentivized to do that. Now, it's possible that I wouldn't, or we could find somebody who wouldn't, but the potential is there, even if there isn't any kind of formal state at all. And I think, although no one yet knows really the details of the formation of the first state, it's very speculative. I personally think there's two possibilities. One I think is more likely than the other. The latter of the two that I think is the less likely would be some type of arbiter. We know that people lived in communities numbering into the thousands that we are fairly certain did not have anything we would recognize as a state. Assuredly, these people had disputes, and at some point it is very likely through the division of labor that certain people appeared as basically arbiters, and that these people, over time, their descendants or whatever, may have become the first proto-kings. I think that's possible, and maybe that did happen. There is evidence of such arbiters. Their genesis into a state is not demonstrated. I think the more likely one, and the one that most people are probably more familiar with, is a religious priestly evolution into the state. And we can actually see that process actually today, even in the United States. Now, I'm not a religion basher, and I'm not a Christian basher. I get along with Christians just fine. But there are certain elements within some parts of the community that I find a little unsavory, and one of them is if you will watch the televangelists. Now, not all of them. It'd be wrong to castigate them all as being one thing or another, but whether they're sincere or not, many of them are able to draw enormous wealth, to be voluntarily given enormous sums of money without really providing anything other than demonstrating to the donator that they have some kind of religious entitlement to the funds. The one who comes to mind is Benny Hinn, which is probably unfair for me to mention because there's probably some who are worse, and maybe he uses all this for good things, and it is voluntary. They're not forcing people to give them. But what the point is that among some people, some Christians, and this is actually true in other religions as well, if some religious figure comes and says the right string of words, then they are entitled to something. It doesn't. I'm not sure what. It probably varies from person to person, but that is a very potentially abusive situation. And especially if the ideological support extends beyond simply giving money. But it's very easy to imagine over time someone like Benny Hinn not saying, I'm asking you to donate, but saying that you have a duty to do so, and if you don't, you're an apostate or you're a heretic. And I actually think that this is a very probable, although not unproven, origin of the state. Now, I have heard people say that it is likely, if you look at the earliest states, uh, typically, if we look at Egypt or Babylon or Uruk or Ur, there seems to have been a priestly class and a political class, and they seem to be separate. And so perhaps there's some kind of it wasn't exactly the priests who took over, but somebody related to them. At the very least, the priests were giving uh, a mandate to the ruling class, and in return, they were, uh, you know, they didn't have to work on a farm or anything. They led pretty good lives. So uh, it doesn't. This is a kind of abuse that I don't think is restricted to the state, but it's necessary for the state. The state needs this. They spend a lot of time cultivating, and the supposed justifications, they've certainly changed over time. You know, we don't have a priestly class now. We don't have a religious backstate. We have basically, when it all boils down to, is a social contract theory. Now, social contract theory is not logical or reasonable. It doesn't make any sense. There's no empirical evidence to support the myriad absurd claims of the state, but that's what they basically go on for now. And all they have to do is have people. They don't have to be enthusiastic supporters. All they have to say is, well, it's necessary at one level or another, and so even if I don't like it all the time, I have to accept it. So there's no point in really actively opposing it, and I don't mean necessarily through violence, although that could happen too. But just you have to. I mean, I think it's similar to the Pharaoh said that the reason that the sun would rise is because the Pharaoh existed. It's like the Pharaoh had some kind of. It was through them that something like the sun. Now we look at that and we think obviously that's absurd, but if you believe that, then the Pharaoh, no matter how tyrannical, was absolutely vital, because if he died, the sun would never come up, and then somehow they realized back then that that would mean that they would all perish. Now today we don't say that the sun will not rise if we don't have a government, but we do basically say that there will be anarchy in the negative sense, that the life will be nasty, brutish, and short, and that we'll all kill each other, and that it will be Somalia or whatnot. And these arguments are actually, when you analyze them, scarcely any less ridiculous than the idea that the Pharaoh causes the sun to rise. Now, why people believe such silly things is another question entirely. I think a lot of it has to do with rational ignorance. It doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily to really learn about something that you don't have a lot of effect on. Just like it doesn't make a lot of sense to really scrutinize and study cloud formations, because let's assume you do learn all the differences between all the kinds of clouds and what they form. You can't really change what's happening. Most people, technology may have made that less true than it might otherwise have once been, but the point is, why would you waste hours of your time doing something that you can't affect? Likewise, why spend an inordinate amount of time studying political philosophy and economics to dissolve the logic of the state, when even having done so, you can't really do it? Well, you do actually do it, because by learning how unnecessary it is and embracing that, you actually do dissolve its ideological bounds on you, at least, and in a very small way reduce its hold on society. And the more that people do that, the more tenuous its power base, and the more likely we are to be rid ourselves of this terrible, terrible, destructive institution. So, and I think libertarians know this, because libertarians always have been on the vanguard, have always considered education as their main objective, or at least a very important one. And I think it's because it addresses this very issue. And the other thing is that ideology definitely can and does change. Now, It's hard to predict how much and how fast it will, but it can, and so we shouldn't despair that, oh, people just naturally want a government. Well, we don't know that. There may be some natural tendencies towards authority figures, perhaps, but that doesn't mean that we have to have a state. We could all just revere our fathers until we're old enough to get our own jobs. I'm not saying that would be. I'm not saying paternalism is perfect or that I embrace it. I'm saying it wouldn't be nearly as bad. And I'm not even sure that that's even necessary because, again, I haven't seen the gene that says that we have to have a God king above us to rule us. Maybe it does exist, but it hasn't been proven, and uh, societies have varied enough over time in terms of their deference to authority that I think it's not a stretch to think that it's not something that's ingrained in our very being. So that's it.